Morning, everyone. We have a problem. There's a serious issue, a critical issue, a fundamental issue that we as a society don't talk about. Well, I talk about it. I'm talking about it now. But in my experience, the more influential, senior, powerful people in our key establishments tend to be, the less able they are to talk about it. What am I talking about? Identity, heritage, ethnicity, race. To me, these are crucial aspects of our being, of our lives, our legacy. But I think that it's something that in this society, for our own cultural and historical and political reasons, we really struggle to grapple with. I'll give you an example. The other day, I met a former colleague who's very senior, was close to my boss in an old professional life, and I haven't seen him for years, and he was complimenting my decision to become a journalist, which I now am. And he was being very flattering. He said, "It's great that you've become a journalist because you're a woman, we need more female journalists, you have great ideas, you're young." Well, I am relative to him. And then he looked nervous. And he said, and he kind of looked to the right. He fidgeted a bit with his fingers. He looked to the left, looked down, and then he said, and you're black. I couldn't help but laugh. I tried not to let him see me laughing at that. And I wondered, why is it so awkward for him to say something that to me is so obvious? And it's not an isolated experience. And I think there are various reasons why this happens. It happens all the time. And I think one of them is that he wasn't sure if that was an insulting thing to say. And on the other hand, maybe he was unsure as to whether that's also how I see myself. And that's not as crazy as it might sound, because I've encountered various competing theories as to my identity. The other day I went for lunch with my partner, who's from Tottenham, and his 8-year-old nephew. And it was no big deal. We went to Wagamama, had some noodles. And when the bill came, his nephew asked if he could see it. And his uncle said, "Oh, it's very expensive." And he said, "How much?" And his uncle said, "Oh, it's £100, which wasn't true. And his little eyes widened with fear. And he said, "Oh, how are we going to pay it?" And his uncle said, joking, I should add, "Let's just make a dash for the door." And his nephew said, "We can't do that, Uncle." And his uncle said, "Why?" He said, "We can't." And then his uncle said, "I suppose you're right. It would be pretty conspicuous, the only 3 black people in the restaurant making a dash for the door without paying." And then his nephew said, "They're not 3 black people. There's 2 black people. She's white," pointing at me. I think when he said that, what he meant was that I don't fit the image that he has in his mind of a black person. He's from Tottenham. In his mind, people who are black live here, talk a certain way, do certain things. He's thinking of his friends and family around him. I'm from Wimbledon. I grew up there. Physically, it's pretty far away from Tottenham, but culturally and psychologically, it is another world away. I was one of very few black children in my school. There was one other black girl in my year at school, and I've been thinking about her lately because there was one incident that happened when we were about 11 years old that really pricked my consciousness. We were on a residential school trip, and there were about 15 of us sharing a big dormitory. And as happens on school field trips, they organised events for us in the evening, so we would all go out in the evening. But she didn't want to come. She wanted to stay in the room. And I remember the first time she did that, thinking, why does she want to stay behind? But anyway, she stayed behind. And when we came back from our evening, we realized what she'd been doing: cleaning. She had gone around the entire dorm and cleaned it, picked up everyone's clothes, folded them in a neat pile, swept the floor. And that really affected me, and I remember not really understanding it, but now looking back, I understand it a lot better. I think she'd internalized a sense of inferiority. The only way she could really relate to being in that situation was to see herself in a position of servitude. And now, as an adult looking back, I find that really, really disturbing, and I think I understand much better the implications of what was happening in our minds at that time. My white school friends, either unable or unwilling to kind of process the repercussions of this, tried to reassure me and said to me, don't worry, we don't see you as black, which in their mind was to say the negative connotations of her identity, we can just try to ignore with you. We'll deny them, we'll look away, and it's fine. Which is, to me, problematic for very, very, very many reasons. So, I'm telling you this not because I think you should be intrinsically interested in my identity or the journey that I've been on, but because I think it does say something wider about the society we live in. And when I was growing up, it was very rare to see people who looked like me, especially in my world. It wasn't rare in Tottenham, I'm sure. But now, those images are everywhere. And it's become a commodity. Ethnicity, race, identity. It's become something we use to sell things. It's become a way of cashing in on the appearance of things being diverse. And to me, that's not progress. And it affects me personally because wherever I've studied or worked, and don't get me wrong, I think I'm a good student and I work hard, but my image always seems to somehow wind up on publicity or promotion, no matter where I am. This is when I was at university. I can't tell you how I ended up on the cover of our prospectus, but I was picked out and said, you must tell your inspiring story. Well, I went to a private school in Wimbledon, so I'm not sure exactly how inspiring my story is. At work, I get told, please go and tell your inspiring story. I mean, I think I've got some feathers to my cap, but I don't think it's motivated by the right factors. And to me, this is not progress. This is going backwards. This is slapping a superficial label of diversity and opportunity onto a situation that is really not. Because if we did live in a society that was fair, there would be hundreds of black people at all the places I've studied and worked who would have organically wound their way onto its promotional material. They wouldn't have had to go around picking the only one they could find, which is often me. So I don't think that we live in a post-racial society. I don't think we've tackled many of these problems, and I'll tell you why. If you look at any typical magazine stand and look at who is on the front covers, or if you look at the royal family, or if you look at the Supreme Court, or if you look at the House of Commons front bench, or if you look at a typical selection of FTSE 100 CEOs, you can really see who is in control of this country, who really has power, how fair things really have become. And you can contrast that to the images that you see in advertising and in publicity where everybody's trying to show that we do live in a fair society. I don't think that we've come as far as we should. Now, I think that this is all complicated by the fact that our identities are becoming more complicated. And being a black woman is not the product of who I am. And I see myself as a black woman. I'm half Ghanaian, I have English heritage, I have Jewish heritage, and I'm very proud of who I am, and I've come through that journey in what I think is a very positive way. And what I love about London is the diversity and the fact that nobody can be summarized by their race or by their parents' country of origin or by the language that they spoke first. It's so much more complicated than that, and I think that's a beautiful thing. On the other hand, it makes it that much more hard to gather together in a consciousness of the struggles that we still have to fight in our communities. The other day, for my job, I'm a reporter for Sky News. I covered a protest that was happening in London over an art exhibition. Some of you may have heard about it. It was by a white South African artist, and it depicted a human zoo, which was an exhibition, a live installation of black people in chains and cages. And the idea was that it was supposed to play on the history of freak exhibitions when black people or Africans or pygmies were paraded around like wild animals or museum exhibits to be looked upon with fascination and horror. And the artist claimed that he was exploring that legacy of racism, of the objectification of black people. The problem many black people had was that they felt that instead of exploring it with the genuine intention of progressing, he was exploiting it for his own gain, and that it wasn't being done with the true intent of raising people up, but instead deepening that exploitation. And so there were protests outside the exhibition in London, which I covered. And it was slightly embarrassing, actually, because I'm a reporter. I have to be objective. My job is to cover stories and show both sides, which I strive to do, as I think all good journalists do. But outside this protest, which was an incredible amalgamation of people of all generations and all backgrounds, all rallying together over this strong sense of injustice and the sense that the legacy and the history of their ancestors was being denigrated for financial gain by this artist. Eventually, the exhibition was closed down. And when I stood there doing my piece to camera, I realized later that I actually looked very pleased, which isn't ideal. But what made me happy about that was not that it had been closed down, because I believe in freedom of expression, and I think it's good that we even have a debate about these things, but because it was so encouraging to see people from this city, from different backgrounds, all drawn together because of their identity, because of their heritage, fighting for it with a genuine sense of consciousness. And that, to me, was an uplifting thing, but it's something that is difficult to do. And I think part of the reason it's difficult to do is because we still struggle to speak about our identity. It's something in this society that makes it hard for people to talk about it and engage with it. Now, I'm in Tottenham, and it feels kind of weird talking to you about the difficulties of expressing identity. In my experience, people from Tottenham have a very, very strong sense of community and are very at ease with their identities. And it's something that people from my background feel quite jealous of. Even though I had so many privileges, what I didn't have was that sense of community and identity that I could easily be part of. But even people from Tottenham, I think, suffer from this. And I recently interviewed a group of young women for an investigation that I'm doing from Tottenham. And it was about a negative experience that they'd had at work and some really horrific treatment they'd experienced from their employers. And they very articulately and bravely catalogued a series of things that had happened at work. And I interviewed them together with my white colleague, who I work very closely with. And it was a very powerful testimony that they all gave. And after that was all finished, we interviewed them for several hours. I walked them out of the building by myself. And I casually mentioned, so the perpetrators, the senior people in this organization who were treating you this way, was there a racial element? And they said, oh, of course there was. They were all white and we're all black. It was completely racial. And I said, but you never mentioned that. And they all went silent. And I realized that in the formal environment of my studio at work, amongst white journalists, they felt uncomfortable saying that. They weren't sure if it was okay. It was only away from that they felt comfortable talking about something which clearly amongst themselves they talk about constantly. And I'm the first to admit that the media often takes a sledgehammer to our identities. Even though I'm a journalist, and perhaps because I'm a journalist, I'm incredibly aware of it. The newspapers are often complaining about immigration statistics, saying that they don't portray the true cost of immigration because they don't talk about second and third generation immigrants. Well, I'm a second generation immigrant, and I'm not a second generation immigrant, I'm British. And the idea that you can label people and put them in statistics measuring the impact of immigration because of their parents or their grandparents, well, if that were true, Winston Churchill would be an immigrant, and so would Princes William and Harry. So there's obviously a double standard there. And the media often does things that I find problematic, just like that. Recently, a friend of mine who works for a high-profile news magazine, which shall remain nameless, was working on a story about Ebola. And she was asked to solicit a video diary from a British volunteer who'd gone to Sierra Leone to help with Ebola. And there are many people from this city and this country who've gone to help. And through a charity, she found a brilliant British guy who did a really powerful diary for her about a day in his life working with victims of Ebola. And when this magazine saw the diary, they said, oh, no, we can't use it. And she said, why? And they said, he's not British enough. He was black. His name's not British enough. He doesn't look British enough. And my friend was asked to go back to this charity and say, could you please find someone else because he just doesn't fit the bill. So where is our outcry? Where is our debate? Where is the open discussion about these issues? It still doesn't happen. And I and other friends of mine in the media struggle to find high-profile people to talk about these things, to openly speak about the things that they witness. It's easy to find people who are struggling from oppression and prejudice to speak about it. But when you find successful people who've pushed through those barriers, they don't want to be associated with the struggles, with the prejudice that goes along with ethnicity and race and identity. They just want to go quietly enjoying their success. And I think that's partly their responsibility, of course, but it also says something about our society, that if you are the black person speaking about race, nobody wants to go near you. Suddenly you become a bit toxic, a bit threatening. So we can't live in a post-racial society until we've lived in a racial society, until we've acknowledged the differences, the heritage, not in a negative way, but in a rich way of what builds the fabric of our society. And in saying that, I'm not saying that everything is about race, because of course we're all part of one beautiful, heaving humanity, and there's nowhere that's clearer than Tottenham, I think. And there's more that differentiates people within ethnic groups than there is between them. And when you try to classify people by race, we all know what happens. You only have to look at Nazi Germany or apartheid South Africa to see the complete futility of trying to classify people by race. A white person is any person who in appearance, obviously, or who is generally accepted as a white person, other than a person who, although in appearance, obviously a white person, is generally accepted as a colored person. That really makes sense. So this is not to advocate that I think that we should start reducing everything to a racial or ethnic level. It's simply to say that these are issues that matter to us. And I think that as the world becomes smaller and as national boundaries break down, as globalization continues, identities become more important. You just have to look at what happened in Scotland or what's happening with UKIP to see how desperate people are to cling on to an identity that means something to them. And so this issue is only going to become more important. We need to embrace it. We need to speak about it. And so I hope that in future, we will be able to have frank conversations about this, and we will be able to imagine a different future.